forest taken root in the center of a metropolis? Join us as we unveil the century-old mystery of Meiji Jingu's sacred forest. This is Omotesando, a busy street in Harajuku, Tokyo, that leads to the entrance of Meiji Jingu and its forest.
I feel like there's a wall dividing the man-made world and nature. I consider this the border between the human world and the realm of nature. I'm going to take a look. Once you pass the wall, it's like entering a different dimension. I'm excited to see what's ahead of me.
Takeshi Yoro is a well-known anatomist. He also loves insects and is extremely knowledgeable about nature. He's particularly interested in the forest of Meiji Jingu.
It's rare to find a forest in a city that has been left alone for 100 years. I don't think there's anywhere else like this in the world. I can find various types of trees here. This forest is a good representation of biodiversity. It's interesting that they first created the forest artificially and then left it. This is an epic experiment. You could say they conducted a grandiose experiment.
What exactly is a grandiose experiment? Meiji Jingu covers 70 hectares. It's the second largest green space in densely populated central Tokyo after the Imperial Palace. This is the main shrine building, the focal point of the grounds. 10 million Japanese and overseas visitors come every year. Right next to the approach where the visitors are walking, there's actually an invisible wall. The area ahead is protected, considered the sacred forest home of divine spirits. Unauthorized entry is not permitted. The white area is the main sanctuary and the approaches. The red area is the sacred forest, which accounts for 90% of the grounds. Our story unfolds here. We'll accompany Takeshi Yoro as he enters the restricted forest. "20-meter-high trees tower overhead, and vegetation blankets the ground. The forest bears no traces of pruning.
This is great.
This large tree died naturally, and it's been left untouched. This is the largest muku tree in the forest.
It's overwhelming.
It's approximately 30 meters high.
This tree is one of the oldest in the forest, which means it has been watching over the other trees around it since they were saplings. Usually, large trees are separated from other trees and specially preserved. But here, they're untouched by people.
And so, all types of trees have thrived. However, surprisingly, 100 years ago, there was no forest at all, just open fields. The man-made forest of Meiji Jingu grew out of almost nothing. It started with just one plan, and the details can be found in this document, which is carefully stored away. The shrine's 100-year-old forest creation plan reveals a number of secrets. And it describes the goal for the wooded area, the creation of an eternal forest that is majestic and sacred. Woodlands in urban areas appear natural upon first glance, but they're often man-made and looked after. The creators of the Meiji Jingu forest wanted it to survive well into the future. Without any help, they aimed to recreate the primeval forest that stood here long ago. So they devised an astonishing strategy. This is an outlook chart for the forest. The triangles are conifers. The cloud-like shapes indicate trees known as evergreen broadleaf trees. Each illustration shows how the forest would look after tree planting in 50, 100, and 150 years. The plan was to plant trees based on a design, then leave them alone. It was a groundbreaking blueprint to revive an ancient forest from the ground up over a period of 150 years. That's the grandiose experiment Yoro was referring to. Let's see what the forest looks like a century later. Famous Japanese flora and fauna researchers gather at Meiji Jingu to analyze the transformation. You can see Yoro in the group. He and 145 others took part in the research on the sacred forest. They received special permission as part of the commemoration of the 100th anniversary of Meiji Jingu's enshrinement. They trade their suits for field clothes before they start investigating. They have no idea what kind of trees or creatures dwell in the forest. The researchers separate into teams by speciality and fan out into the forest.
35、110。
The tree research team is focused on measuring trunks. They record the type, thickness, height, and location of every single tree on the premises. Even though no one knows how many thousands of trees are here. It's believed the job could take 2 years. The thorough investigation will judge the century-old experiment as either a success or a failure. This is the insect team. Its members are also eager to take part in this once-in-a-lifetime ecological opportunity to track the growth of an artificial forest. This moth researcher throws something at the trees.
これはビールと黒砂糖と、焼酎とそれをこう混ぜて。
He's using this fake sap to attract moths. In a landscape that resembles that of the Amazon rainforest, the aquatic organism team floats out onto a pond. The mammal team sets up sensor cameras to record the activity of nocturnal animals. At dusk, Shinto priests close the doors of the main sanctuary. No one is permitted to enter during the evening. But the insect team remains to continue their investigation. They use lights to gather specimens. Here comes a Japanese rhinoceros beetle. They arrive one after another. The researchers are amazed to find so many males with magnificent horns. Keep in mind, this is the center of Tokyo. A sensor camera picks up something. It's a raccoon dog. Another one arrives. It seems they are a family. And another one. They forage for worms, insects, and nuts under the fallen leaves. The researchers show for the first time that multiple families of raccoon dogs live in the Meiji Jingu forest. It's morning, and a raccoon dog emerges from the woods. It arrives at a place where there's water from a spring. It's a popular tourist spot called Kiyomasa's Well. The sign says, "No drinking." But the raccoon dog doesn't care. Already, we're getting a better picture of this forest and the animals that call it home. Meiji Jingu was built back in 1920. They created this place to enshrine the souls of Emperor Meiji and his consort, Empress Shokin. At the same time, they planned to cultivate a forest that would be a resting place for the imperial couple's souls. Their vision would soon transform this bare patch of land. 3 scholars designed the forest creation plan. Seiroku Honda was one of them. He was Japan's first doctor of forestry, known as the father of parks. The other 2, Takanori Hongo and Keiji Uehara, were Honda's apprentices. They understood the cutting-edge techniques Honda had studied in Europe. They wanted to build an eternal forest that would mirror the wooded area that existed here in ancient times. A few thousand years ago, long before Tokyo came to be, a forest of evergreen broadleaf trees, such as Japanese chinkapin and oak, thrived year-round. During that time, young trees always grew from acorns, and the generations changed seamlessly in the forest. The 3 scholars considered those conditions ideal, and they worked to recreate them. But unexpectedly, someone who opposed their idea spoke out. It was the prime minister at the time, Shigenobu Okuma.
Your forest looks like a bush. It's not suitable for Meiji Jingu. Plant Japanese cedars like other major shrines have.
Okuma had a different vision for Meiji Jingu, and he harshly criticized Honda's plan.
The forest we are planting is not a bush. A forest of evergreen broadleaf trees is suitable for Tokyo. The soil in Tokyo is not suitable for cedars. Ridiculous! Academics are supposed to make the impossible possible.
But Honda made his case using scientific data. The empty fields had poor soil and little water. Cedars are not suitable in this kind of setting.
A forest that will survive here for many years to come can only be made of evergreen broadleaf trees. You insist on using cedars. But if the forest is not successful, it will be your fault.
Eventually, Honda's near threats convinced the prime minister, and he finally approved the evergreen tree forest. The project got started in 1915, 100 years ago. The main Tokyo station was completed that same year. The Japanese capital had begun to grow. Honda and his team picked the trees and advertised for help. Many people responded and offered to donate saplings to Meiji Jingu. 100,000 trees came from across the country, and 110,000 volunteers from young men's associations came to help. It was the largest project of its kind. Crews created dedicated train tracks from Harajuku Station, located next to the shrine. It's believed 30 cargo trains delivered supplies daily during the busiest period. Finally, it was time to plant the trees into the barren ground. The 3 scholars had a secret plan. Although they wanted to create a forest of broadleaf trees, almost half of the planted trees were conifers. Pines and other types of conifers could survive in infertile soil and create the basic shape of the forest. In between the conifers, the volunteers planted broadleaf trees, following the scholars' detailed instructions. We can get a better idea of their strategy by taking a closer look at the forest creation plan. In the first phase, the trees were laid out in consideration of the natural competition between them. The volunteers planted small broadleaf trees between large conifers. After that, they were left alone. With the passage of time, competition between trees would occur naturally. Then, since broadleaf trees grow faster, the conifers would be pushed out. Eventually, the forest would be like a primeval one, consisting mainly of evergreen broadleaf trees. That was their projection. In nature, it takes several hundred years for bare ground to evolve into a primeval forest. But Honda and his team planted trees based on a plan that would see the forest completed in 150 years. This was an experiment not tried anywhere else in the world. Crews spent 6 years planting the trees. Then, on the 1st of November, 1920, Meiji Jingu was completed. This rare aerial video shows how the forest looked at that time. Human hands planted tens of thousands of trees. Now it was up to Mother Nature. Fast forward a century. While Tokyo has expanded into a metropolis, the untouched forest has grown too. The researchers are trying to document the changes. The man who's crouched on the ground is among those looking for answers.
これも羽衣イタチタケだと思うんですけどね。これそんなにどこでもポコポコ見つかるキノコじゃないんですけどね。これが載ってる日本の図鑑ないでしょ。また変なもん出るね、ここは本当に。
Elsewhere,
これ結構すごいかも。これ写真撮ってください。
the experts were surprised by the tiny white mushrooms sitting on the larger ones. This type of mushroom is so rare in Japan, it's believed to have been found only twice before. In all, the experts discover more than 150 varieties of mushroom. They also come across creatures no longer seen in Tokyo. The aquatic organism team finds Japanese rice fish. They used to live everywhere in Japan, but now they're endangered.
これ3種類ともよそから持ってきたとかではなくて、本来そう関東地方にいる生き物。
The researchers don't find any exotic species, such as black bass, which prey on local fish. Native Japanese dandelions cover the ground. But elsewhere, Western dandelions have mostly driven them out. The Meiji Jingu forest plays the role of a wall and keeps out exotic dandelion seeds. Over the past 100 years, Tokyo has grown into a sprawling metropolis. The shrine's forest has taken on the unexpected role of protecting its occupants from the outside world.
There are some stumps. There are often bugs in places like this. There are mushrooms. When I see the stumps, I strip off the bark. Ah, here you go. Can you see it? It's a single-horn rhinoceros beetle. It's not found very often anymore. It's rare in central Tokyo. Probably anywhere around here. This place is kind of like an island. It contains the nature of old Tokyo. The forest is like a time capsule. And now, we're opening the time capsule. I enjoyed catching these when I was a child.
The investigation finds 3,000 types of flora and fauna, including species that managed to avoid extinction, species newly discovered in Tokyo, and entirely new species. The tree research team will spend the next 2 years surveying all the trees in the forest.
32頭
During their survey, they learned something unexpected. The team was actually building on earlier investigations of the forest. Researchers following in the footsteps of the scholar Seiroku Honda had carried out 3 studies in the past. They learned that of the 100,000 trees that were initially planted, about 26,000 of them had a diameter of over 10 centimeters. 10 years later, the number of trees increased gradually, but 50 years later, the total decreased by 3/4. Further research showed the tree count continued to drop. So, was this epic forest building experiment, which was left up to nature, a success? In truth, there is one thing people do at Meiji Jingu that is helping nature grow the forest. Some staff members are in charge of sweeping the leaves on the approach to the shrine. It is an important daily task. They don't throw away the collected leaves. Instead, they return them to the forest floor. This management method is described in detail in the forest creation plan. It reads, "Fallen leaves look useless at first sight, but they shouldn't be removed, as they can be a rich source of nutrients for trees." The forest creation plan states that fallen leaves on the approach must not be wasted and must be returned to the cycle of nature.
永遠の森ということをよく私ども申し上げるんですが、サイクルっていうことはまさにそこにあるんだろうと思うんですよね。大事にそれを次の世代に育て、次の世代もまた次の世代にへと、それが鎮守の森の大切な心であろうと思います。
And at Meiji Jingu, this rule has been strictly observed for almost 100 years. Let's look at how the collection and return of fallen leaves affects the forest soil. The soil organism team arrives for its investigation. Professor Junichi Aoki leads the group. Beneath the dead leaves, life is ongoing. There are numerous creatures less than 1 millimeter in size. They play an important role in breaking down the fallen leaves and returning the nutrients to the soil. The investigation reveals the existence of a diverse range of soil organisms, including pill bugs. This land was bare 100 years ago. It now has rich soil that supports a vibrant forest. Rhinoceros beetles also eat an abundance of rotten leaves as larvae. Then, when they grow, they emerge in huge numbers during the summer. Year after year, the fallen leaves have nourished creatures in every corner of this forest. These mushrooms are a family of common inkcap. They open their caps at night and in the morning. Then they die. A more surprising sight is this slime mold. This latest research has found almost 100 types of these organisms in this forest. Slime mold eats bacteria while slowly growing on fallen trees and dead leaves. This slime mold is actually attacking and eating the mushroom. This slime mold moves like an amoeba, then suddenly changes shape. It changes into what looks like a mushroom. Then it spreads its spores to reproduce.
This is an acorn. It will grow up and be the next generation of this forest in 100 or 200 years. It all starts with this.
A dead tree is left untouched in the forest. Fallen trees also eventually decompose into the soil, spreading vital nutrients. Once trees come down, more sunlight spills through the canopy, giving birth to a new generation. This is exactly how the natural cycle was outlined in the original forest creation plan. How has the forest grown and thrived during the 100 years? One animal shows us just how much. This is the bird team. People have enjoyed bird watching at Meiji Jingu for more than 60 years. They've held monthly sessions since 1947, and they've kept records. The years of observation and documentation tells us about the interesting changes in bird diversity. This is a Japanese pygmy woodpecker. It's a forest species. Up until the 1960s, there were no Japanese pygmy woodpeckers here. However, their numbers began to increase in the 1980s, and they started to produce offspring. This graphic shows how the forest's bird population has changed over time. Green pheasants and Siberian meadow buntings, which live in sparse woods, disappeared in the 1980s. And the forest-dwelling Japanese pygmy woodpeckers and another type of bird started to appear. This bird is known as the king of the forest. It's a northern goshawk, and it reigns over 3,000 kinds of creatures in the forest. Northern goshawks were first observed in the mid-1980s, and from 2007 they began raising offspring every year. Northern goshawks nest on trees more than 20 meters high. In May 2014, more chicks were born. The northern goshawk chick was almost ready to leave the nest. Then, a surprising confrontation. Unusually, the chick begins to chirp vigorously. A nearly 2-meter-long Japanese rat snake appears. It smelled the young bird and climbed to the top of the tree. The parent bird heard the chirping and raced back. In the end, the chick was too large, and the snake gives up and leaves.
森林性の鷹、オオタカがですね、こういう都心の森に来るということは誰も予想していなかったんです。で、最初は冬場だけだったんですけども、これがだんだん一年中定着するようになって、ついに繁殖もし始めたんですよね。で、これは非常に驚きなんですけれども、食べ物がヒナを育てる分だけあるところを彼らが選ぶと、彼らにとっての餌資源が十分あると、そういうことを一連ずっと見ていると、だんだん森林になっている、深度が深まっているというか、森林度が深まっているというような状況が明らかに見て取れます。
Finally, the researchers released the results of their tree studies. It's the answer to whether the century-long forest experiment has paid off. This data shows trees with a diameter of 10 centimeters or more. Red indicates conifers, Dark green represents evergreen broadleaf trees. Conifers that accounted for half of the trees 100 years ago were significantly reduced to less than 10%. Instead, evergreen broadleaf trees now comprise 2/3 of the trees. The number of trees decreased to half compared to 100 years ago. However, the size of the trees has grown. 244 trees had a diameter of over 1 meter, which was not seen in past studies. And there was also a pleasant discovery. The number of seedlings or baby trees reached 400,000. As the founders of this project expected, this became an evergreen broadleaf forest, which evolved naturally over generations.
植物社会という言葉もあるんですが、植物は、じいちゃんばあちゃんがいて、お父さんお母さんがいて、で、子供たちもいて、いずれは孫も出る、そういう構造になってます。兄弟もたくさんいて、性格もみんな違う子がいたりね、それぞれの役割もあるんです。この森はそうなってました。肥料もやらない、手入れもしないのにちゃんと実が落ちて、それが発芽して次後継樹になっていくと。で最後は全体でまさに東京のど真ん中にオオタカが住むというね、天然林になるわけですよね。
The extensive experiment seems to have played out precisely as predicted by the three scholars. Yet there is one thing that defied their expectations. Tree research, including this present investigation, has taken place 4 times over 100 years. We reconstructed the timeline based on the collected data. This is how the forest evolved. In 1924, the forest is only a few years old. The trees are still thin and most are only 10 meters tall. The forest is a combination of conifers and broadleaf trees. Already, Mother Nature has taken over. 10 years later, the trees are growing steadily. Later, a major change occurs. The conifers cannot receive sufficient sunlight. They gradually die off. They've lost out to the broadleaf trees. Sunlight now shines through the open space, and the buds of the next generation of trees emerge. 50 years after the forest was created, the generational change forecast by the scholars begins. Broadleaf trees become taller and taller, more than 20 meters tall. Northern goshawks arrive in the forest as if they've been waiting. After approximately 100 years, this man-made forest has already turned into the natural forest that was originally envisioned. And it happened 50 years earlier than Honda and his team's forecast of 150 years. Mother Nature defied their expectations.
It's amazing how they made this. Rather than saying make, it's more accurate to say this forest turned out like this after 100 years. Mother Nature can do all this in that amount of time if we leave it alone. That's amazing. Also, it's very important that this forest is in metropolitan Tokyo. Only when we think about the people who made this and what will happen in the future will we realize what it means to look at things long term. I don't think they thought the area surrounding the forest would change this much. But the trees grew according to their own rules. And many creatures now depend on them. The forest has preserved itself. We are so fortunate to see the forest untouched like this today.
It all started from a barren piece of land and a single plan. One can only imagine what Honda and his team would think if they could see it today. Over the past 100 years, Tokyo has grown into one of the world's premier cities. At the same time, a man-made forest at its heart has returned to an ancient time. This is an exceptional story of how a primeval forest was created in the middle of a metropolis. Meiji Jingu, a place where people and nature live side by side. Another new day begins here in the forest.